This is Dave Snowden. I've got various titles ranging from Professor at the Complexity Centre to Professional Curmudgeon, and I'm not too much fuss which you use. And this is the Agile Uprising podcast.
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Agile Uprising podcast. This episode was recorded live with audience participation. So when you hear references to populating the backlog, dot voting, please don't try to play along. Now, on with the show.
Hello, welcome to the third in a series of webinars where we explore the topic of leadership. This series is co-sponsored by Agile Velocity and the Agile Uprising. Today's theme is leadership, making sense.
1 moment.
In times,
Sorry, I don't know.
Siri wants to join us. Making sense in times of uncertainty. Co-hosts today are Richard Dolman and Colleen Johnson. It wouldn't be an Agile Uprising without snarling somebody's last name. Thank you both for joining me. We're delighted. Yeah, we're delighted to be joined by our two panelists, Dave Snowden, founder and chief scientific officer at Cognitive Edge. We spoke with you, sir, oh my God, it's been 2 years on Zombie Agile. It's great to have you back on an Agile Uprising show. And first timer, Andrea Tomasini, one of the founders of Agile 42. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We were chatting, you're an Italian living in Germany, and that sounds like a complex adaptive situation now.
Indeed.
Yes. Before we close out today, we'll provide information on how you can get in touch with our panelists and learn more about the great work that both of them are doing. And hello to people from all over the world. We had about 100 people register, and all of you got a link to our Lean Coffee board, and I'll paste that one more time into chat for those who just arrived. Add your questions. You can also cast your 3 votes, and we'll use that to manage the topics. After initial question to our panelists, I'll screen share that, and you'll see how it works if you're not familiar with it. Also, if you want to do some live social commentation, here's some handles and here's some hashtags. So our first question, and I'll toss it out to you, Dave, first, comes from Brene Brown's book, Dare to Lead. What, if anything, about the way people are leading today needs to change in order for leaders to be successful in the complex, rapidly changing environment where we're faced with seemingly intractable challenges and an insatiable demand for innovation?
I'm not sure I'm wild about the way the question is framed, because leadership is contextual. So if you take the current COVID crisis, and I'm currently just finishing off the European Union field book on how to manage in a crisis. And the core message there is, in a crisis, you impose draconian constraints, and then you stop making decisions and you coordinate, you distribute decision making. Yeah. So that's what you do in a crisis. On a day-to-day basis, I think leadership is not so much an individual function, that's a crisis level. It's more a collective function. So some of our work, for example, on crews, which is a military concept, is leadership is effectively a crew. So you always have a pilot, but who's occupying the pilot role can change. So I think, you know, this very North American, Northern European concept of the great leader who directs and leads and has different qualities is probably something we should break away from. Yeah. And you can see this. I mean, if you look at Steve Danning's, you know, every time Steve Danning writes a book, every successful leader or every successful company has to be made an example of it. And there's a massive amount of contortion to achieve that. I mean, Steve Jobs, yeah, is a unique character. I'm privileged to have had a pile of books thrown at me by him in my one encounter, right? But he's completely different from the former CEO of General Motors, for example, or GE. Yeah, so leadership is deeply contextual, and we need to stop talking about leadership as a quality which can be defined.
Thank you. Andrea.
Well, I obviously agree with what Dave said. I also support the idea as we talk about leadership mostly as an organization capability these days. So it's a shared function, is a way for people to, in a way, manifest the and guide what are the natural disposition of the culture in which they are living in. So leadership and culture co-evolve. It's not something that you can isolate from one another. And I also don't believe in great leader and in human being who can exerce leadership in a way that makes an organization successful. Is a little bit backing up on what the concept of crew is. I think successful company have a successful leadership concept and leadership culture, which is embedded into what everyone does. It's not the single outcome of an individual.
Colleen, Richard, anything to add?
I really love that concept that leadership can come from anywhere in the organization. And I think it's something that gets stifled in a lot of big companies because of the hierarchy and organization, just our org chart structure, right? Like you guys are saying,
Right.
It's a different construct on things where people look to someone else to guide them or to fix things, instead of saying, how can I be empowered to help solve problems or help drive change? And that fundamentally, like Dave said, has to change, I think.
But the message isn't anti-hierarchical. If you look at a military environments are hierarchical, but in context, a weapons sergeant can outrule a brigadier. So in a military environment, leadership is much more role-based and interaction-based than it is individual quality.
It's not a position in the hierarchy, it's a role played in the moment.
And crews can delegate authority without loss of status. So for example, in the British Air Force, a flight sergeant is effectively a pilot. So he's inferior to a wing commander until they put on flying gear. If the wing commander is a navigator, the wing commander accepts the sergeant's instructions while they're flying the aircraft. So that highly role-based contextual leadership is something organizations need to switch to. And it's something Agile needs to learn, because Agile is definitely into a sort of new age fluffy bunny approach to leadership and qualities and love and harmony and peace and all this sort of nonsense. The reality is, leadership is a harsh role-based structure, and you need to put effort into it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, given that, if we want to think about it as a capability and a shared capability, what does that mean in today's remote, extremely remote distributed reality that we're having to deal with?
I think we haven't worked that out yet. I think it's deeply problematic. So you're getting heavyweight Zoom fatigue at the moment. Yeah. So whereas you could interrupt time with travel or between meetings, all right, you've got a problem. The reality is a lot of trust is based on smell, not on visual or oral clues. So one of the reasons when you're presenting to a group, you can get better feedback, you can adjust, is because you're getting more than visual or oral stimulation. So I think that leadership in a distributed virtual environment is something we're only just starting to explore. And whether it's sustainable or not is another issue. I think there's a real danger if you go entirely virtual. It's like my children can't smell snow coming, whereas I can.
Right.
We could, you can smell snow. I grew up in the country. I can smell snow coming. My children can't. We could lose the capability of making trust-based judgments if we move everything to a virtual environment.
There's so much lost. Smell is a huge sense. And now we're seeing body language from here up and from straight on. And that's it.
Yeah, my saga these days is pajamas, lycra for the bike, bath pajamas. And occasionally
you don't want to know what is
a collar right to look now. More appearance. Yeah, it's kind of like, but that's life, all right? It's different.
Yeah. I'm going to switch over to the lean coffee, and we've invited everybody over. Let me make sure I got the right screen. So if you're not on the lean coffee, go over there now and take a look. Cast your 3 votes on what you want to talk about. And while you're doing that, I was tempted to ask Dave to sing a Welsh song, but before the show, we talked about that, and he kindly declined. He says he reserves that for only certain situations. What were they, Dave?
Avoiding bears in the Rockies and Welsh rugby matches.
And we have correlation, but not causality, because you've met how many bears in the Rockies? 0?
0. I keep getting pissed off about this. I met loads of mountain lions. I've been tracked 4 or 5 times, but I've yet to meet a bear.
And has the singing attracted or deterred the mountain lions?
That's an interesting question. It made them curious, for definite.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and start the discussions, and they have a new user experience. So Richard, you're going to grab the first question. Feel free to reframe it, and we'll run it for about 5 minutes. And after that, there'll be Roman voting on to continue or not. So open up the screen. I'm going to stop the screen share so we can see everybody's faces.
So in a previous discussion, you spoke briefly about transparency causing issues in agility. And can we dig into that further? Is transparency the issue, or is transparency in an unsafe environment where the real issues occur?
Okay, you need to go back to Aristotle for this, all right? Sorry, I'm a philosopher.
That's a philosophical answer.
Good thing we put a time box around this one, everybody.
Fine, but just, I mean, Aristotle basically said any human virtue is the average of the virtue taken to excess or the virtue not present. So saying you will never lie, we all know is foolish. Saying you will lie all the time means you're called Trump or Boris, yeah? The reality is if you have too much transparency, nobody will take risks because everything is visible and they have to accept the consequences. If you have no transparency, people can become perverted and change it. So you need to work out an optimal level. I mean, I survived in IBM for 7 years because I fell within a rounding error of $250,000 a quarter. You got used to the size of things in IBM. So senior executives could hide people and get away with it. Then Sam Polizano came in and nothing could be hidden anymore. And that destroyed a lot of innovation because nobody would take risks. So it's a balancing act. You need to have enough transparency to avoid corruption, avoid stagnation. Yeah, but not so much transparency that people can't hide some things and take some risks.
Would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps a side note. I mean, everybody always scream about transparency, but in oftentimes people misunderstand transparency with the right to know something, and you have to be very clear. You need to have a culture which is able and ready to consume information. Otherwise, transparency is just creating more noise and distracting people and confusing people. And oftentimes, when you have a lot of people and distributed in many countries and speaking different languages maybe, and you try to be transparent, actually you spend more time catching up with everybody what was actually meant with that type of information rather than what was the real intent originally to allow people to know what was happening. So, and this is why on one side, as Dave said, we have to be careful because making everything transparent can also backfire. So it's not the recipe for everything. And this is, I think, is one of those agile meme which went on forever. The fact that in order to apply empirical control, you need to know all the information you can about the state of something so that you can inspect and decide how to adapt. And this requires transparency. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden transparency has to be, an all granted characteristic on everything we do or everything we want to do. So that's a very dangerous statement.
It can also be hypocritical. So if you're going to take the complete transparency, programmers should have direct access to user experience. But Agile doesn't like that. So it tries to actually aggregate the experiences into backlog. So it breaks its own rules.
Well, I suppose it's a matter of focusing also. So if you want people to focus and have a common direction, you have to be able to interpret information and create a message which people can align with or can buy in. And what we often end up doing is that if we advocate a radical transparency, and in the end, we are actually allowing people who tend to be vocal and manipulative to play the game they want. And this is happening a lot in big companies, especially when it comes to politics. You see people who actually misuse transparency because they leverage information they care about and they ignore information which they don't care about. and it ends up actually being more damaging than helping in that sense. I've lived that personally a couple of times. Even in our small organization, we still have many countries to handle. And when people try to be transparent, it turned out they actually, in some cases, try to push their own ideas forward and claiming that the fact that they couldn't do it is because of lack of transparency. While at the end of the day, is just, judgment of those information and being able to understand what's the value in it for us, and how are those information then helping us doing a better job and delivering better value. So
right. So that's the end of the time box for the audience. Look up on the screen in your Lean coffee board, make a choice to extend or end the topic or no preference. And it's neck to neck.
I was going to say, we're going to end up with a tie.
Yeah, let's move on. Let's try to get some more in.
Just pull. Just pull.
All right. Call, you want to grab the next one?
All right, let me get it here. Well, and I think we were just starting to touch on this too, but the question is, what has been learned from recent events that will result in long-term sustainable change for organizations? But I think as we started to talk about here with just even interaction, right? Maybe long-term and sustainable don't go hand in hand. So maybe that's two separate answers. Let's start with you, Andrea.
So can you rephrase it? Can you repeat the question? Because I don't think I understand what is aiming at.
Yeah, I think what we're getting at here is, with everything going on with COVID and working remote and everything changing kind of around us, what could be things that we've learned from this that organizations want to keep around and want to keep in place?
Well, from my perspective, I can tell you a couple of things that I have learned from my organization and things that I have learned from client organization we are helping these days. I think we went through a phase of shock. So at the beginning, everybody just went, oh my God, what is happening? Is this real at all? And just freeze everything. And they froze asset, they froze budget, they sent everybody home and said, go home and, wait it out. And then a few weeks later, everybody realized it's not going to go away anytime soon. We can't sit this one out. We need to do something. And surprisingly, what happened is that a lot of people ended up having a lot more of one-on-one call on Zoom than they ever had in the whole previous year. So manager basically reflected to okay, I need to talk to my people. I need to see how they are. And I'm just saying positive things at the moment, but they all felt like all of a sudden empathy. They realized the situation is chaotic. People need guidance. They need a voice who tells them what to do. And many leaders felt in that position. They went like, okay, let's plan now one-on-one all day long from 8 to 5, and let's see what happens. And there's been a lot of talking and supporting somewhat with empathy, trying to make people understand, hey, don't worry, we will figure it out, and stick around with the team and so on. We even ran a pulse recently. We had over 500 responses at the end of the day. And the result was, what helped people the most is actually to have a good collaborative culture in place, or to have decent collaboration processes and tools in place. So many organizations, as it might seem ridiculous in 2020, they weren't absolutely able of working remotely. So they didn't have any remote VPN access to their core resources to do their job. They didn't have application in the cloud. And especially companies who produce hardware and work in the workshop floor. You can imagine how those companies have been affected. I mean, we are talking here in Germany, we had all the automotive supplier like BMW, Porsche, Mercedes, Volkswagen. They actually closed down the manufacturing for 6 weeks. Can you imagine? That never happened since the First World War. This is the first time in history that Mercedes stopped producing car for 6 weeks in a row. So the reaction initial period has been extremely panicking. And now people are trying to catch up. They understand there are ways to contain the crisis. But I think what still many people, there's two categories at this point. So the initial panic is gone. We are in a phase now where there are some people on one side who think you can go back to normal and do everything like it was before, and pretending that whatever is happening, it's over, or in some cases, you know, it didn't touch me or anybody I know, so must not be true. And on the other side, we have people who are extremely cautious and are spending a lot of time in focusing on well-being, because there is a serious problem of employees working in home environment. There is a psychological attachment to the same four walls, and there is no psychological switch between I am at home or I am at work. And this accumulates over time an immense amount of stress, because people have difficulty going out of that context. And so well-being is primarily important from a leadership perspective. The other thing which is important is safety, also psychological safety. As Dave mentioned before, as human, we are used to interact with one another with all senses. And now we are forced since 3 months only to see us and to hear us, each other. And we are missing some senses, and this creates some sort of detachment. So whether, if we have already trust relationship established, we can leverage that probably on the digital media for a while. But if we don't, and I have example of many people who have been hired during COVID crisis, and they were onboarded digitally in a company, and they are absolutely out of the organization culture because it is not reshaped, and they have not yet the rituals and the procedures in place to help people understand how to do work. So these are the things that I think in this moment in time are emerging as more useful. And I bounce it to Dave.
And I think you got micro and macro effects. So what actually happened when COVID hit is organizations, the level of different types of interactions, the level of information flows exceeded the capacity of anything in the center to control it. So what you actually saw was employees ad hoc in solutions. Yeah, collaborative arrangement. People found ways around it. And also processes were short-circuited. So we've seen, for example, we're doing work with the NHS at the moment on real-time lessons learned. And if you're not doing real-time lessons learned, you're being really stupid, because capturing lessons learned in the field under fire is absolutely critical. So we've deployed learning journals for that across the NHS. And the procurement process for that took 24 hours. 4 weeks into the crisis, the bureaucracy has now found a way to control things again, and everything is taking 4 or 5 weeks. And that's inevitable, right? You can only switch to a certain extent, but the capacity of a system to accommodate itself is a key learning. And organizations which can adjust to that, but it's not complete. I mean, I had this big argument with Carl Weick once. So he basically did a book with Cleff on high reliability organizations, and talked about organizations or types of organizations which share failure, which from a knowledge management perspective is key. If you share failure, knowledge is flowing. The trouble is, all of his studies were crews, firefighting crews, aircraft carrier crews. And I famously said at a conference, you know, the book's brilliant on its research, but the conclusions are false. I can replicate the behavior of firefighters if I burn the office down every morning, but that's not an acceptable organizational design. So we need to find ways as the context shifts to adjust across that. And I think organizations aren't thinking about that. And they're not thinking about unintended consequences. Another key in the new EU handbook, which is about to be published, is to set up an unintended consequences unit. Because the one thing I know about a complex adaptive system is whatever happens, there will be unintended consequences. So partner-on-partner abuse, child abuse is going through the roof at the moment. There's people that can find, right? People's job mobility, their ability to focus is getting disrupted. So the unintended consequences are starting to creep out, and we're not thinking about those, and they can be good or bad. And at a macro level, I think, people aren't thinking this through yet. I mean, neoliberal and free market economic assumptions have been destroyed by COVID. I mean, one of our former prime ministers, it's interesting, it's rather like the American presidents. I never thought I'd look back on Bush with fond memories as somebody prepared to be rational. And I never thought I'd look back on Theresa May as somebody who had some intelligence. But she famously basically said there's no such thing as a magic money tree, which is a classic, rationalization process. Well, now countries are creating magic money forests left, right, and center. Yet in a real crisis, money isn't a limiting factor. Now that offers huge possibilities that we're not thinking about at the moment. Yeah. The other thing on this is we've got three major simultaneous crises coming together. So one is COVID. And if anybody thinks that's going to be over within the next year, you've been really stupid. It's about to get worse, significantly worse. Yeah. We've also got climate change. And if you think COVID is bad, God help us when we get to climate change. I mean, lockdown is nothing. In most of the areas around the equator, in my lifetime, we'll have to go lockdown for 4 or 5 hours a day in air conditioning, or people will die. Yeah,
will there be mass migration? More
mass migration. And the other one is Black Lives Matter, which is far more significant than we think, right? Because that's actually a rise of a different, and you can see it behind the populist movements in Britain as well, on the other side, on the far right side. So the level of despair, or the level to which you've had a homogenization of the political system and exclusion, is creating different sides of rebellion from left or right. And we're starting a project with Extinction Rebellion and other people at the moment to try and connect the three. Because if you can connect attitudes to COVID with attitudes to climate change, with adequate, then you have a possibility of doing something. And I think it's that interconnectedness of the way people are feeling, which we've probably got a 6 to 9 month horizon to exploit. Otherwise, we'll miss an opportunity.
Yeah. And I'm wondering at a corporate level, if the need just to survive is just blocking out any conscious effort to really learn and examine what it means for the organization.
It's an apex predator moment. So basically, the dominant, I mean, it's the meteor struck the Earth and the dinosaurs won't survive. And the question is, where's that small furry thing called the first mammal? And we won't see it yet. So there's a huge opportunity. Yeah. The danger is that the level of capital concentration in the big technology companies may actually prevent a biological process of evolution. And that's significantly scary. Microsoft, Apple, Facebook.
Dive into that more. Unpack that one.
Okay, so we're in an age where information transmission becomes key, but the control of information is controlled by a limited number of people. Yeah. They're heavily based on big data and artificial intelligence, so they're text-based, and text is about 10% of what you know.
Yeah.
They're also working on AI algorithms where the training data sets have been created by misogynist young males living on the west coast of the United States who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, with all the consequences which come from that.
And the inherent biases in their algorithms.
Yeah. So we're in a very dangerous world because the information control is centered. In a normal crisis, information control would be distributed, but it isn't. Right? So the danger of perversion in the system is really high at the moment. And unless governments are prepared to take action against the Facebooks of this world, and Facebook is probably the worst, in that sense. Twitter's started to do some sort of measure of independence, but Facebook, God help us, Unless you get some type of disruption of of the information monopolies, we've got a problem.
Well, it's also being aggravated by the fact that people spend a lot more of time online now than they used to do before. And
there's no validation. It's like I've quoted this a lot, but I'll quote it again. A friend of mine in the Mounties famously said, it used to be that every village had an idiot and it didn't matter because we knew who the idiots were. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy and exit Britain from Europe and elect the president of the United States, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. The current approach to information on the internet has no buffers in it. And if you have a system without human buffering, it will always become perverted. All right, and we've got to find ways to increase the buffering and increase the fragmentation of the system.
Yeah. So there's a comment that came in from Paul. How do we disrupt that flow of information that's being, managed by the Facebooks, the Microsofts, and the Twitters?
Well, first of all, is to change the data form, and we've been doing experiments now in Wales, Columbia, and elsewhere, which actually, I said 8-9 years ago. This is a big project which we did a proof of concept of, using children as ethnographers, so you know where the data is coming from. You validated it within communities. And I said, if we ever have an epidemic, we'll need this because we'll need a distributed information capture mechanism. Now that's now getting taken seriously. We're having, National Lottery just put some money into it. We're now talking with the UN, etc. It's kind of like, there's a famous British phrase, closing the stable door after the horse is bolted.
Mm-hmm.
But the good news is there's a lot more horses to bolt if we don't do something, right? So I think we have to increase it's the interaction at the front end of data creation, because just having proof of, you can't just validate data sources because the bot machines will just get cleverer and cleverer. All right, so you need to increase the human element within the internet in terms of that first stage validation.
Also, perhaps to go back to what Richard asked before about enterprises and economics, and now do you reconcile the fact that on one side you need to lead people and create comfort or create support, but on the other side, if the economy doesn't recover, it's going to be difficult for organization to balance between the two things. So the morale is we do need money to go ahead and create work and create value. But the problem is we are still in a toxic economy at the moment. So there is no new economy. We are not creating any new value compared to what we created before. So in the past week, there's been certain branches of the industry which have been somewhat even favored by the crisis, by the pandemic, and they actually made ridiculous amount of money in the first quarter of this year, more than they did in the previous 2 years together. And there are some industry which weren't even allowed to operate. Think about all the hospitality, tourism industry was basically shut down by government boundaries. And there's a lot of money in that industry, which basically stagnated. So the people had the money to put in there, but they couldn't. And so they put it in Zoom, they put it in Slack, they put it in other tools which were needed at that moment in time. But there is no new value creation yet. So the opportunity of the mammal hiding somewhere that we don't see yet, we still have to pick it. And there's probably going to be new business model emerging, hopefully soon, because this economy is stagnating. Because sooner or later, the people who consume the services and pay the money to these big guys who are making money now, we run out of money eventually. And we already see that many people are having trouble paying their loan for the houses because they are having a reduced salary. Or the Microsoft already announced today they're going to close down all their shops, and this is going to hit them with 380 million only this quarter because they will not make that income. So there's a lot of things happening around which we cannot control yet. So the situation is extremely unstable, and talking about what are the right behavior or the right thing to do as a leader out of context is absolutely probably the wrong thing to do, right?
Come back to this issue, the concentration of capital is the problem. All right, so you've had increasing concentration of capital and increasing income disparity. Yeah. And the association and I never thought I would see a British Prime Minister stand up in Parliament and just lie consistently for 2 weeks, knowing that the lies were self-evident. Yeah. Right? So, and that's actually really scary. I mean, Trump is bad, Boris is the same. All right? And you can see the same in other leaders, kind of like, it's now become irrelevant. So that high concentration of power, because remember, the only economic model that we know in the history of humankind for massive resource deprivation is patriarchal feudalism. And that's kind of like the model which we'll get unless we consciously do something different.
That begins to lead into the next question, perhaps, if I'm reading it right. What do you think a leader's role, and this is the crew leader, not the hierarchical leader, what do you think a leader's role is in dealing with pluralistic ignorance, situations in which a majority of group members privately reject a norm, but go along because they assume incorrectly that everybody else accepts it? I don't need to wear a mask.
I think actions speak louder than words in that respect, right? So there's an interesting difference between South Florida and North Florida. North Florida doesn't believe in evolution. South Florida does, because they're about to all drown. So it's kind of like being driven home to them, right? And one of the key things, if you can't persuade people to think differently, but for example, if you put people into apathetic empathetic context, they will behave differently. They won't do it if you just talk about it in abstraction. So I think part of the role of leadership is to change the dynamics of people's interaction with themselves, their communities, and their environment. I mean, I for my various sins, did several months field ethnography in Tea Party communities in the States a few years back. And I remember going back to DC and talking to some very senior Democrats and said, you guys have got this all wrong. These guys are socialists. They're not right wing. If you actually look at their practice, they're socialists. They look after each other. They're dense in their community. Nobody goes poor within that group. It's centered around the church, etc. And they just can't understand why you do these things, because they manage that. And I think at the moment, I mean, this is David Chalmers' point, in the Anthropocene, left and right, modernists and postmodernists are irrelevant concepts. What really matters is, do you care about other people and do you care about the planet? After that, everything else is irrelevant. And I think we're not getting that refocused in politics or government or industry or anything else. But we are seeing a shift. I mean, we were doing work last year with one of the big oil companies. And one of the reasons they wanted to understand things is good people don't want to work for them anymore, because they don't want to go in a pub and say, I work for X, because that makes them evil. So we are seeing some shifts on that. The issue is, how do we accelerate it?
Well, and building on that, I mean, how do you do that with sincerity? We've talked on the Agile Uprising podcast about the flood of Black Lives Matter emails from big corporations that feel more like a timely gesture than something with real soul behind it and meaningful change. So how do big organizations really create caring action for people and for the environment?
I think they need to stop talking and start doing. I mean, most big corporations have got, I mean, let's take IT, all right? Let's take the Agile community. IT remains one of the most misogynist communities in the world. Deeply, deeply, inherently, structurally, systematically misogynist. If you allow people to score other programmers and they don't know the sex, they score people completely different if they don't know that and if they know the women and so on. And all corporations have got policies to stop this, but they don't do anything. Once they've written the policy down, that's it. So I think we need to stop people writing policy and talking about what they're going to do and talking about how things should be, and get them to do small things which actually are consistent with those principles.
I think that as long as the rule of the game don't change, and they're probably changing now, so the economical pressure and the pressure to reposition and repurpose businesses and value delivery in this period is probably bringing a lot of companies to the knees. And we hear this every day. I mean, we have even business partners who are writing us crying email where they say, sorry guys, we can't hold it anymore and we have to go, out of the game. But I think until the economical rules don't change and people are still driven by this need to survive and make money anyway, I don't think any other policy which is about caring or about environment or about green policies or whatever is going to ever be successful. And I go as far as saying is us responsible for it, because if we were caring about it and every one of us as consumer, as buyer, would pay attention to which company is being environmentally friendly, which company is respecting certain rules of engagement, which company does certain things, and we would go beyond the product and just look also at what the policies behind that are, and we are responsible for it. If we all of us were caring more about this stuff, we would probably make a bigger difference.
Yeah, maybe I'm a little skeptical when I see organizations, to Colleen's point, kind of come out vocally about Black Lives Matter or climate change. I'm just always wondering, are they being forward thinking or are they just being opportunistic to kind of play into?
I mean, the New Jersey Declaration theoretically excluded slavery except in Maryland, right? But nothing changed for about another 150 years. De facto slavery continued. Right, in terms of the way it works. So it's this words not action is a deep problem in human society. Britain abolished the slave trade. It didn't actually abolish slavery. It just abolished the slave trade, right? And so on. So that this hypocrisy is kind of like built into human nature. And trying to say it's not the case makes things worse, not better.
And I mean, from my perspective, take it as an ignorant European, Central European perspective. The fact that you start saying we do something special for the Black people is actually racism. You are making them different from everybody else. And the same thing I have when we go, I mean, we have operations in South Africa again. We have a lot of colleagues down there, and we go down and we meet each other oftentimes. And then you experience life in South Africa, and you see how South African people, white, are overly gentle and overly polite with Black people around the street because they fear to be finger pointed by other wealthy people who say, oh, look how this person treated the Black guy. And I go like, well, the only reason, the simple fact that you treat them differently is racism. Even if you treat them over gently and you treat them more ignorant than you or more needful than you, you don't see yourself at their level, and is automatically being racist. And so I think the whole story about is something that we have to be careful with. Those organizations saying we do something special for the Black people, or I was very sad when Tim Cook from Apple announced the other day at the WWDC keynote, he said they launched the Black Code program. And I go like, what? What is it? I mean, why there is a special program where Black people get money to write code? What is different between them and the other white people? Why you have to make it explicit, right? The more we make it explicit, the more there will be parties choosing one of the two sides, and racism will be even more than before.
Yeah,
so
it's an interesting paradox. Yeah.
You get this. I remember arguing in South Africa, kind of like, if you guys don't reform yourselves, people will impose quotas. And of course, that's what happened. If you look at what happened in South African rugby, it didn't really change, despite the World Cup, despite Mandela. And so finally, people got desperate and they imposed quotas. And the same is true. You see the same in the United States. Yeah, if people don't reform of themselves, then people get into legalistic solutions to the problem.
Yeah. So just a final question on this topic, maybe. So is corporate consciousness and corporate responsibility, is that more of a needing to be a grassroots movement, or is that leadership kind of setting the example to get the rest of the organization to truly start to model that behavior?
I don't think leaders should ever try and set an example. They should do things which set an example. Mm-hmm. I mean, I keep saying that if you think first of all, if you want to be a leader, expect to be unpopular. I mean, that's one of the key rules. It's why politicians who can't cope with unpopularity are so bad. Mm-hmm. Because the reality is you're there to be a focus for blame and everything else, right? You just need to live through it in that sense, right? And I do think it's one of the things we advise leaders, if there's negative stories about you, go and do things which make those stories impossible to tell. Don't say they're wrong. All right? And I think that's what you've got to start doing. But I think also we need to look at the mixture of hierarchy with distributed command. It's not that you abandon the hierarchy, but you have hierarchy plus distributed command. And it's the pendulum swing. It was a big problem with the Agile Manifesto. Mm-hmm. It swung the pendulum too far. IT had got too controlling, so it swung the pendulum right the other way rather than doing a both and. It did an either or. And I keep doing this on social media. The minute anybody in the Agile area of the community produces a 2-column table with the bad stuff on the left and the good stuff on the right, I just hit it these days. I've given up being nice about it, right? Because it's just not the case. There are no universals. Everything is contextual.
Yeah, I think that as far as we try to tackle the problem with policies and regulations, we will fail. We need to start tackling the problem from an ethical and cultural perspective. And I don't mean it in terms of we have to have, a honky-dory culture where everybody hugs themselves and all agree and align, and there is never a problem, and we celebrate failure and we dance around the fire when we make a mistake. So this type of things are also extreme. But the real problem is if we are true to the value system within our culture and we behave ethically and respectfully of that value system, then we will probably form a culture and attract people who thinks and value the same thing. And they've said we have to be consistent with that. So the leader who tries to be the nice guys with everybody so that everybody keeps on saying, yeah, we like him, is probably not going to last long, right? Because you will be incoherent inevitably. You can't make everybody happy, but as long as you are clear about what you are trying to achieve and you keep coherent, consistent in your direction, and you act without ever going against your ethic and your values, then there will be people who hate you and there will be people who love you, but will always be the same people, right? You will not be like a flag in the wind, and depending on what happens, you say something different. Mm-hmm. And in that way, you nurture and create a culture which is becoming coherent over time, because you know who is hating you and who is not hating you. And as Dave said, instead of saying the one who hate me are wrong, let's try to make it impossible for them to hate you. So let's try to shift the context. Let's try to do things that are okay for them. Let's go for compromises. And I think in this time of uncertainty, we all have to be more open to diversity. We have to be more open to multiple options. We have to explore multiple things in parallel. And this goes from an economical perspective and a corporate standpoint in terms of value streams, exploring new business model, but also in terms of workforce and culture and how we handle people. I didn't talk with a single client after the first 3-4 weeks of COVID in Europe that didn't agree that whatever happened next, they are going to seriously consider an hybrid mode of work where people can choose if they want to work from home or if they want to go to the office, no matter what. Because everybody realizes that there are values on both sides, and there are people who are better off working remotely, and there are other people who need interaction, or simply because they don't have the conditions at home to work in a peaceful and concentrated way. Yeah, and we have to accept that. I mean, there's many people who have,
which I would follow. So I have a heuristic for conference keynotes. Yeah, I want a third to be inspired, a third to be confused, and a third to be really upset. And if I can achieve that, I've done my job, right? And the same is true for leaders, which doesn't mean they hate you, but all of the things they took for granted should be shaken up. All right, and it's leaders who can do that you need. Yeah, it's that ability to inspire, confuse, and upset in various combinations, which makes progress.
Awesome, Richard. I think we have time for one more question. And
one more question.
It turns out that it's a good segue from what we were just talking about.
Yeah. So share your thoughts about the value of dissent as well as outliers in decision making.
Oh, I think I'm going to answer this one. No, go ahead, Dave.
You want me to go first here? Yeah, you just want to give me your normal nickname.
Exactly. So there won't be anything left to say after this talk.
We should crowdsource who goes first.
Okay, so the second most popular method I've ever created is ritual dissent, which I actually learned from looking at Aboriginal decision making in the Kakadu in the 1970s, which is high levels of ritualized conflict, no new age fluffy bunny, we've all got to agree with each other. Yeah, and vicious all-out attack and see what comes out of it, because that increases the amount of variety within the system. When we do the games that we run, which are human mediated, right? We make sure that everybody fails, nobody can succeed. And it's not just because I watched too much Star Trek when I was young. It's actually because failure increases scanning and density, whereas success doesn't. Yeah. So I think it's less, and it was interesting. IBM, there was kind of like a competition. It kept me going for 5 years till Sam came in and took over from Lou. There was kind of like a competition between general managers to who had the worst, most disruptive maverick. And I was happy to occupy that role for several people over the 7 years, all right? Because they could hide them within the rounding error. And the really good leaders valued that dissent. It was like the court jester role. Right. You spoke truth under power. So, and that's why I dislike things like open space. I dislike things like common values, common purpose, common objectives. It's all about homogenization. So we have a key phrase. What you want is coherent heterogeneity, not homogeneity. Mm-hmm. So you want sufficient difference that there's evolution, but the ability to come together. And the way I normally illustrate that is, I mean, if you come to the back of my car, you will see, stickers for the best rugby team in Wales, which is called Cardiff Blues. We have highly, efficient, brilliant skills, and we're always honest and we always follow the rules, And there's those bastards down the road in Llanelli who are a bunch of tin men who bribe referees, commit unspeakable fouls at the scrum, and they cheated us in the last match when we should have won it. But if the English come, we're all Welsh. So it's that ability to be different and to be similar in different contexts. And the homogenization of the HR community, the desire for everything to be the same, is deeply disturbing.
Andrea?
Yeah, so on the topic of dissent, I just want to say something funny. I mean, there's a lot of ritual we were used to, especially in the Agile community, which work very well when you are in person. But there's a lot of people who struggles to translate those into new ritual, which achieve the same purpose when you work remotely. And many people try to translate literally what they were doing on a physical board and transport it to the digital media, which is the same mistake all the press industry did at the beginning of the 90s, where the web appeared. And what they did, they basically took magazine, they photographed one page at a time, and they replicated on a web page. And they just pushed the button next when you finish reading so you could read the next page, right? So what I mean is we are translating, in principle, the same exact act on a different media instead of understanding how to achieve the same purpose on a different media. So when you do ritual dissent, it turns out that you can do it on Zoom very effectively by using breakout room and swapping people. One person goes into another group, then you let them pitch with a time box. When they're finished pitching, they mute the mic, they shut off the video so nobody can see them, but they hear the whole conversation that the other group is talking about, and is actually quite effective. And we have been doing this in the past week. Is a lot of fun, and the best thing is you can record it and show it to everybody else afterward, and that generates.
Come on, Andrea, that's breaking the rules.
It's genius.
That's pure maliciousness. That is.
Everybody loves it because it's a way of dramatizing the fact that we are kind of imposed in working in situation and condition which is not ideal at the moment. But if a little bit of fun and a little bit of self-irony is helping a lot in these days, I think.
There's actually a key complexity principle it's worth remembering, which is called disintermediation.
Yeah.
So you need to remove any interpretive layer between the decision maker and the raw data. And I said once at a conference in South Africa, as it happens, that HR departments are 90% of the problem. And it used to be HR departments were an ex-military officer with a couple of secretaries, and it kind of like worked. And now it's become this institution, and most HR departments have a Stockholm syndrome relationship with the CEO. They've bound him into a set of perverse beliefs that he or she can't escape from. So, I remember building a system for Jan actually when he was CEO of SmithKline Beecham, in which we used a medieval principle. It was a virtual community in which we had persona. And everybody knew the CEO was there, but nobody knew which persona was the CEO. And I would do that again. I mean, I've done that a few times since. It's a brilliant way of doing it because it's like medieval kings who used to walk into the tavern. Nobody knew they were the king. And we've lost that capability.
Yeah.
Well, have we lost it? Or somebody just commenting, in Zoom, I don't know who the leader is. And we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and if we had built Zoom differently, the highest paid person would have the biggest thumbnail, and they would automatically be at the top of the gallery view.
That's called Microsoft Teams, isn't it?
You might be right there, sir.
Yeah.
We are coming up on the end of our overall time box, and this has been such a great discussion. I want to thank our two panelists for spending a decent chunk of their evening with us, and give them an opportunity, a couple minutes to share best way to get in touch with them and what you have coming up. Andrea.
Thanks, Andy. I mean, you can Google me. I think you'll find
you.
Yes, plenty of pointers. and what I'm working on right now. So, I mean, Agile 42, we have been approaching the crisis quite radically. So we really went all back together like a big family. We call it for a while the communist mode, because we said we don't leave anybody sinking. We keep everyone alive no matter what the economy tells us. And we start radically doing experiments every week. So every week we have new things that we are testing and trying out to probe new areas. So we are now, we launched recently a couple of new products, digital products that we are kind of proud of. We have new online training, self-learning modules that we launched in the last couple of weeks. So all of those stuff. And I'm working with Dave on enhancing organic leadership. And we just had a conversation a few days back, which opened a lot of new door and possibilities. So watch out, and those things are coming next.
We've been warned. Professor Snowden.
I'm fairly easy to find, all right, on social media. I mean, it's quite interesting. Trolls don't realize I quite like seeing how far I can take them. I regard it as success when a troll blocks me, and a failure when I block the troll. So you can find me on social media or at Cognitive Edge. A big thing, which is going to be next week, is the field guide to chaos and complexity management, done jointly between Kinevin Centre and the European Policy Lab. And that puts together a whole bunch of Cognitive Edge methods and tools in a sort of coherent pathway. So that's big. Yeah. We've just finished off a series of projects on climate change and post-pandemic futures. And we're now going to start to put those together with Black Lives Matter in a coherent program. And if you want to look at the COVID work, particularly, we're doing some pioneering stuff there, like field-based lessons learned, putting teachers together with parent and pupil clusters, looking at abuse in the homes. There's a whole set of programs there. And that's kind of like a focus at the moment.
Awesome. A few words from our sponsors. Richard, tell us a bit about Agile Velocity, and then Carl, give us the Agile Uprising.
Yeah, those of you who may not know, so Agile Velocity, we're a small group of very dedicated and I believe passionate Agile coaches and trainers. Similar to what Andrea was saying about Agile 42, you know, we've been digging deep during this time and trying to re-team, reimagine ourselves, running small experiments, and being in a position to kind of stay together as a team and be able to respond to the market as things start to open up. And this series that Andy has been so wonderfully leading is just one way for us to kind of keep the voices in the community and give everybody an opportunity to share and learn. So I really appreciate both Dave and Andrea joining us today.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Carl.
Yeah, Agile Uprising is a purpose-built network that focuses on the advancement of the Agile mindset and global professional networking between all practicing Agilists. We welcome every skill, point of view, methodology. We try to be very open to all different opinions and points of view. And you can find us at agileuprising.com, where you can see our discussion boards or past podcast episodes.
Awesome. To all our attendees, thank you for taking the time to join us, for your wonderful questions. We'll be releasing this as a podcast, hopefully by Sunday. And I hope the insightful discussions will help you lead in today's environment. And if you ever want to argue with Dave Snowden about the best gin to drink, I will follow you along. I assume he is a masterful gin and tonic mixer. That's it. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague. If this is your first time tuning in, please subscribe to our podcast. If you'd like to join the discussion, share your stories about effective leadership over a dram or two of Penderin, please visit us at agileuprising.com. Join the coalition or the Discard forum. Finally, support from listeners like you will help us cover our hosting and podcast production costs. See the show notes for details how you can become a patron.